It's true that we're quite used to seeing representations of Jesus Christ in Hollywood film productions, aren't we? The person in question usually has very long hair, accompanied by a beard that can vary in style, often with a skin tone that tends to be light. In addition, this person's eyes are also light-colored, which contributes to an appearance that can be perceived in a distinctive and striking way. If we take a look back at the past, we can see that in the art of the Renaissance period, for example, many of Jesus' characteristics were represented in a recurring way. However, if we analyze the artistic productions of medieval times, we notice that there is a certain representation that, although it may lack the representation of clear eyes, nevertheless reflects conceptions of that time. If we go even further back in time, we come across representations of Jesus that are more typical of a Mediterranean context. On the other hand, if we turn our gaze to the Ethiopian region, we'll find a representation of Jesus with a darker skin tone, something that matches the appearance of Christians from that region. If we decide to go even further back, to the early period of Christianity within the context of the Roman Empire, we will see representations of Jesus that resemble a Roman man, with characteristics such as the absence of a beard and short hair, similar to the images we can see in different works. However, we can go even further back and discover one of the most archaic representations of Jesus that we know of, possibly the oldest in existence. This representation, intriguingly, reveals an appearance that is totally different from what is commonly imagined, since instead of having light eyes, he has long hair. This is at least one of the assumptions that can be made in order to interpret this image. That's the main one, isn't it? At this point, I intend to explain the justification for this situation and, in addition, bring to light certain fascinating aspects that are represented in this particular image. After all, why is there a donkey's head, isn't there? The origin of this expression or doubt is generally understood as a reflection on where something comes from, be it an object, an idea, or a piece of information. It refers to curiosity about the roots or historical context that gave rise to what is being questioned. It is a questioning that seeks to understand the foundations, origin, or beginnings of a particular subject, allowing for deeper analysis of its characteristics and meanings. This comment should not be interpreted as an unfounded offense, as it is intrinsically related to some particularities that characterize both Judaism and Christianity. This connection is especially noticeable when analyzed from the point of view of individuals who were neither Jews nor Christians during the time of the Roman Empire. Furthermore, there is an additional aspect that is quite intriguing, the realization of Jesus' crucifixion, which undoubtedly deserves consideration. This aspect makes this graffiti work of significant importance when considering the ancient practice of crucifixion, which is a topic that continues to be widely debated to this day, especially in relation to how exactly Jesus would have been subjected to execution. Certainly, I'm happy to follow your instructions and help you step by step. What would you like to cover or discuss? Initially, I'm going to explain every detail of this image in detail. After this presentation, we will dedicate ourselves to analyzing the controversies related to the donkey's head, which are present in the image, as well as exploring the implications of the crucifixion. We will also address some minor interpretations that, although less well known, also permeate the debate on this image and are quite intriguing. These issues will be commented on briefly at the end of our discussion. Next, we will return to the city of Rome, which is fundamental to understanding the theme we are dealing with in this video, which focuses on a very interesting and peculiar testimony about the history of Christianity in ancient times. To begin our analysis, it is essential to take a detailed look at what is actually found on this particular inscription, which is known as the Alexamenos graffiti. This artifact is often referred to as blasphemous graffiti, which implies that it contains elements considered offensive or disrespectful towards certain religious beliefs or figures. So let's delve into the characteristics and significance of this particular graffiti. This graffiti, which has a historical origin, was discovered on the wall of a building known as the Pedagio, which dates back to the time of the Emperor Domitian. This building served, in a similar way to a boarding school, as a space for reception and education. In reality, the building in question has an older history than most people realize. During the reign of Emperor Domitian, it was used as a kind of boarding school for the training of page boys. It is located in the vicinity of the Palatine Hill in Rome, which leads to its other name, Palatine graffiti. As for when this graffiti was created, there is some controversy among scholars in the field, but the most widely accepted hypothesis suggests that it was created in what is considered to be the middle of the 3rd century, specifically between the years 200 and 300. Is that right? Especially in the early period of the Ice Age, this is the main expectation of scholars of history and archaeology, who are dedicated to investigating and understanding the events and changes that took place in this context. However, in any case, when we look at the image that is actually in front of us, located in the top right-hand corner, we can see the figure of a man standing with his arms open, demonstrating an open posture, while his back is turned towards the viewer, can't we? In this context, we can see that the subject's back is visibly exposed, which plays a significant role in analyzing and discussing the meaning that this image can present. In addition, it is important to emphasize that the character depicted has a head that resembles that of an equine, which is a remarkable feature and worthy of consideration, isn't it? Possibly, this is an animal of the equine species, known as a horse. However, it is intriguing to note that there are lines that represent a horizontal line under the figure's feet, as well as a horizontal line at shoulder height that aligns with the figure's hands, and there is also a vertical line that interacts with these other lines, thus forming a kind of cross that serves as a support for the feet. This aspect will be analyzed in more depth later. In the bottom left-hand corner of the illustration, we can see another figure, one of whose hands is raised towards the crucified man in the scene. Accompanying these two figures is an inscription that reads, Alexamenos adores God, or his God, or even a god. The most common interpretation would be Alexamenos adores his God. This expression is interesting, since the position of the raised hands can be seen as an indication that this is the Alexamenos who is in the act of worshipping a god, since the posture of worship, which consists of raising the hands, was traditionally associated with both ancient Christians and non-Christians. So this reading seems quite appropriate, don't you think? So we come across this image. But what is the reason why people tend to interpret this as the letter N? What is the reason why historians and archaeologists interpret this figure in question to be specifically that of the crucified Jesus, rather than considering the possibility that it could be another personification or historical figure? What would be the reason why it couldn't be? Crucifixion was a fairly common practice in Roman society at the time, which leads to the conclusion that it could have been used in relation to another person or historical figure, doesn't it? The choice of Jesus in particular becomes relevant due to a variety of indications that point to him as a central figure. These clues are found in historical, theological, and cultural contexts, which intertwine and offer a deeper understanding of his importance. Furthermore, analyzing these points reveals aspects that reinforce the uniqueness of his message and actions. Therefore, the discussion of why Jesus is often highlighted requires a careful consideration of these clues that direct us to this emblematic figure. Initially, we can see that he presents himself as a man who was crucified, and at the same time is referred to as God, which in itself constitutes a very significant emblematic figure. One aspect that deserves emphasis and attention is the question of the donkey's head, a point of significant relevance. It is important to emphasize that we are referring specifically to the donkey's head, and not to the animal as a whole. The donkey's head was, in fact, often associated, by people who did not belong to Christianity, with the Jews and, consequently, with Christians. This is because Christianity, in its origins, developed as an offshoot of Judaism. In this way, Christianity has a very close relationship with Judaism, to the point that it ended up inheriting many of the stigmas and insults that were directed at Jews, and, by extension, Christians also began to receive these same insults during the early days of its formation, especially in the first centuries of its evolution and development. At the beginning of Christianity, we have several historical testimonies of this in various sources, both from Christians and Jews and from non-Christians and Jews. So the first important author who talks about this relationship between the donkey's head and the Jews specifically is Flavius Josephus, who is Jewish and writes a text called Contra Aeon, in which he records that some non-Jews said that the Jews worshipped a donkey's head in the temple in Jerusalem, and that Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, a Seleucid king, saw this donkey's head made of gold when he invaded the temple in Jerusalem. This was before the revolt of the Maccabees. So there is this record in Josephus of Josephus being annoyed at the fact that non-Jews were saying this about the Jews, that the Jews worshipped a donkey's head, who's a Roman historian from the 1st to the 2nd century, says in a book called Histories that the Jews were saved in the Exodus. So he recounts his telling the history of the Jews, and he says that a fundamental episode for the history of the Jews is the Exodus from Egypt, in which Moses leads the people from Egypt to the so-called Promised Land, and, on this journey, the people begin to feel very thirsty, and then a herd of donkeys appears, and Moses follows this herd of donkeys and finds a source of water, according to the taste. The Jews would have erected the image of a donkey in the most sacred place of their sanctuary, and it's quite likely that they would have been enchanted by this image, isn't it? So you can see that this is a subject that was in fact in evidence during the time when Christianity was beginning to establish itself and spread, isn't it? The process of forming this association between the figure of the donkey and the Jews took place, for the most part, among individuals who did not belong to the Jewish community. Therefore, it was non-Jews who largely contributed to this relationship. It is clear that under no circumstances did the Jews agree with or accept this proposal. This narrative has been strongly contested and denied on several occasions. However, it wasn't only the Jews who were obliged to eliminate these rumors, which have been linked to the concept of holatria and the supposed worship of a donkey since ancient times. Christians, for their part, also had to confront these unfounded allegations. A notorious example of this is the author Tertullian, who produced a work entitled Apologia. In this book, he mentions that there were individuals who maintained that Christians were close to Judaism, associating them with the idea of holatria and the veneration of a donkey. However, Tertullian endeavors to forcefully refute these unfounded accusations. From a point of view that is not limited to a strictly historical approach, but rather focuses on more rhetorical aspects, it can be suggested that the Romans had a deep veneration for a variety of animals and for entities that were a fusion of human beings and animals. In this sense, it's possible to imagine that the Romans might have been questioning or even disapproving of the fact that Christians directed their worship specifically at the donkey, instead of revering the vast range of animals that they, the Romans, venerated so much. This situation could be interpreted as a limitation in the Christians' perspective, since by choosing a single animal to worship, they move away from the rich diversity that marked Roman devotion. He's just rebutting the aggression, so to speak, and it's also interesting because there's another text by Tertullian that says that even the Jews, who were originally the people accused of holatria, were at the time of the 2nd to 3rd century accusing the Christians of holatria, hurling this insult that they had received against the Christians. So he says in this text that a Roman Jew accused the Christians of being hocoets, right, donkey worshippers, and this Roman Jew walked around his house displaying the image of a man in a toga with donkey ears and feet, which represented the Christians, right, archaeologically there in the 19th century. I don't know if I said the date at the beginning of the video, right, but this graffiti was found in 1857. But when this graffiti is found, it fits perfectly with what we already knew about this period and about this cultural, religious, and social tension between the Jewish Christians and the followers of Greco-Roman traditions, who will be called pagans later. I'm choosing not to use the term in question at the moment, but that doesn't pose a problem. Do you agree? So this situation clarifies quite effectively the reasons why a person who doesn't identify as Christian could somehow interpret or represent Jesus, correct? It is with a limited mind, comparable to that of a donkey, that one sees this whole situation involving entrenched traditions, troubled polemics, and insults that circulated widely in the past. Now, changing the subject and tackling another topic that also has significant relevance, it is important to highlight the issue of crucifixion, which is present in a striking way in the graffiti we are analyzing. It's important to emphasize that this is yet another way of belittling and offending the image of Jesus that is represented there, isn't it? In this way, we can say that the expression "the donkey's head" is the first type of offense or insult that can be identified. The fact that he is facing away from the people in that particular place is, in fact, a very common form of contempt or disrespect, and this attitude is a form of insult often used in representations of this kind. Finally, we can consider the following question. The crucifixion can be interpreted as a manifestation of contempt, can't it? The cross, although today it has established itself as a largely positive and powerful symbol, representing salvation, good and even spiritual protection in rituals such as exorcisms, has a rather dark origin. This object, which many people wear as an amulet hung around their necks, actually had a completely opposite initial function, serving as a cruel method of torture and a means of humiliation. It's important to note that even during the early growth of Christianity, the cross still retained this character as an instrument of execution. It wasn't until the reign of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century that this symbol stopped being used as a tool of condemnation and death in the Roman context. For those who were not Christians, the concept of a god who had been crucified seemed extremely absurd and laughable, which emphasizes the profound transformation that the cross has undergone over the centuries in its cultural and religious interpretation. It was undoubtedly a great lack of wisdom, something that was configured as an enormous contradiction, wasn't it? There is an instrument that is used to carry out the execution of individuals who are considered the most terrible in society, and this is associated with something that has a sacred or divine character. In this context, Paul, in his scriptures, especially in his first letter to the Corinthians, makes a relevant mention. He states that the message of Christ crucified, as well as the idea and preaching of this crucifixion, is seen as a scandal to the Jews and as true foolishness to the Gentiles. Furthermore, it is interesting to note the perspective of a Roman author who comments that he heard people say that Christians worship the head of a donkey, which demonstrates once again the distorted view that existed about Christians at that time, as reported by another author who also refers to this theme. The author mentions that people had a strong admiration for the head of a donkey, which is considered the most humble and inferior of all living beings. He also reports based on his observations and information acquired, that these same people venerated the figure of a criminal who was crucified, a practice that can be considered surprising. So, according to what this author heard, there was worship directed at both this lowly creature and a bandit who faced death on the cross. An evil individual who had previously been subjected to the act of crucifixion, and who also intensely worshipped the very cross that had served as his instrument of execution. It is important to emphasize that the graffiti in question uses crucifixion as a form of execution and humiliation, which provokes an interesting reflection. Instead of conveying a message of salvation, as is traditionally expected, the representation of the crucified Christ is used to ridicule and satirize. Furthermore, an intriguing point about this artistic manifestation is that the cross the artist chooses to draw is a conventional cross, the one we are used to seeing in our daily lives. Therefore, this aesthetic choice makes the work even more striking and provocative. You're referring to this cross that has a configuration similar to that of a small T, aren't you? The figure known as the cross can be interpreted in different ways, taking into account that its visual representation is quite faded on the wall where it was originally found. This worn condition can influence the way we observe and understand the drawing. So, really, these types of decals, don't they? These reconstructions often present a level of clarity that, on certain occasions, surpasses what is conveyed by the drawing. The upper part of the cross is positioned in such a way that it resembles the end of a tiny T, doesn't it? On some occasions, the top section of the cross can be framed by the horizontal line, can't it? On the horizontal line that extends to the top, it's correct for the letter T to be capitalized, isn't it? The commissary cross is a military decoration that is awarded to members of the armed forces in recognition of their outstanding service in specific missions. This medal is often awarded at major events where soldiers have shown exceptional courage, dedication, and professionalism. The symbolism behind this decoration dates back to historical traditions and, as well as rewarding individual valor, it also serves as a morale booster for other members of the armed forces. With a rich and significant history, the commissary cross has become a symbol of honor and respect within the military context. I hope you've understood what I'm trying to set out. However, I plan to insert some images into the edit at a later date, which will make the explanations more visual and, consequently, more understandable. The central aspect I want to emphasize is that, in previous periods, there were many different variations and shapes of objects, weren't there? There were different types of execution instruments that were commonly referred to as crosses or storos, a designation that covered different shapes and structures used for capital punishment. In the context of the New Testament, the terminology used in Greek to refer to certain instruments of torture was wide-ranging and encompassed various types of tools, so it is not possible to determine from this word alone which specific object or exact shape the author of the text was referring to. This means that even when this nomenclature appears in the New Testament scriptures, we cannot definitively say that it is the cross we know today, which is a very common representation in Christian iconography today. In fact, there are some denominations within Christianity that adopt the interpretation that the instrument of Jesus' suffering, rather than being the typical cross, was actually a vertical stake, in other words, a simple column, and that Jesus was nailed only to this structure. I have already briefly expressed my opinion on this issue in a video in which I answered some questions that were put to me. However, I must emphasize that the word in question does not have a meaning that exclusively defines it in any sense. This means that it does not necessarily refer to an upright stake, nor to the cross that is commissar, nor to the cross en masse or the cross in X, which, by the way, has another name that I can't remember at the moment. Furthermore, it's important to emphasize that this word doesn't have to correspond to a specific object, since it appears in a text by Lucian of Samata, who was an author active in the 2nd century, in which the term is used to describe the situation of Prometheus, who was chained in a quarry. Therefore, in this narrative, there is no reference to any wooden object, and it is described that Prometheus was crucified, which shows that it is a word with a high degree of polysemy, that is, it has multiple meanings. The expression in question is quite complex and can be associated with a number of different interpretations. As a result, we can't say with complete certainty exactly what type of execution instrument was used to condemn Jesus Christ. However, taking into account the graffiti bearing the name Alexamenos, which is estimated to have been made approximately 200 years after Jesus' death, it is possible that the object in question had a specific shape, isn't it? The expression T-shape refers to a configuration or structure that resembles the letter T. This organization can be observed in various contexts, such as design, architecture, or even the arrangement of furniture in a room. Understanding this shape involves analyzing the specific characteristics that define it, such as the combination of vertical and horizontal lines that intersect at a point, providing a distinctive look. The T shape can be used to optimize spaces, create divisions, or facilitate circulation in a room. What this means is that if you add various other proofs or additional information, it becomes obvious, doesn't it? There are several other texts dating back to the 2nd or 3rd century, right? Long before the time of Constantine, various sources already mentioned the instrument used to execute Jesus, the crucifix, being described as having a shape similar to a T or something close to it, right? The Greek letter, with its rich history and meaning, is something that can be found with considerable recurrence in texts dating back to antiquity. This presence can be seen in various works, where the use of symbols and characters from the Greek alphabet is quite common. Furthermore, it is important to note that, at the end of discussions or analyses, the Greek letter can also serve as a form of conclusion or synthesis, indicating a closure to the ideas presented. Just to examine other possible ways of understanding this image, it is essential to clarify that there is no consensus among all historians regarding the interpretation I have set out at this point. This interpretation represents the predominant view, or rather the majority view, but it's important to emphasize that this discussion was already underway in the 19th century, when this inscription was first discovered, wasn't it? When this graffiti was first discovered, several authors hypothesized that the figure depicted could actually represent a deity other than the one worshipped in the Christian faith. Among the possibilities suggested are the figure of the god Anubis and the god Set, who are deities associated with different religious traditions, according to the interpretation of two scholars present at the analysis. The head representing the Egyptian god Anubis has the characteristic shape of a jackal, while the figure of Set, another important deity in Egyptian mythology, has the head of an animal whose identity is shrouded in mystery. This animal, often referred to as Animal 7, is an enigma because it is impossible to define precisely which species it belongs to. There are various theories about its origin, taking into account the possibility that it is an already extinct creature that belongs to a group of canines, a new category of completely different animal, or even the conception of a fantastic being, a hybrid animal that was created for mythological and symbolic purposes. However, in any case, these writers and intellectuals who worked in the 19th century, didn't they? A small number of writers and thinkers who lived during the 19th century brought up this conception, according to which this idea could be considered a beneficial or positive reference. It wouldn't be appropriate to think that a person is making fun of someone else. In reality, the mention of the Alexamenos can be interpreted as an allusion to the devotees of Anubis, who is an Egyptian deity considered to be the protector of those who have died. In addition, the Alexandrines can be seen as a group or set of gods who have an intrinsic connection with themes involving death and communication between the world of the living and what is considered the afterlife. In this way, this connection can, in a way, justify the allusion to the crucifixion, and can be related to the practices and beliefs surrounding these deities and their representations in funerary rituals. There are also other ways of interpreting this issue, which may be related to Gnostic groups, such as the mention of the 7 years, which are linked to the 7 sons of Adam. However, it's not necessary to delve into this specific type of interpretation, as these discussions represented very restricted areas of study and are now practically irrelevant in academic circles. However, there is an alternative proposal that is similar to this and has been developed more recently, hasn't there? I recently had the opportunity to read about this subject in a specific chapter of a book that I'll show you on screen shortly. However, in that chapter, the authors developed the argument that the representation of the crucified figure could be associated with Set or Set Typhon, right? The name attributed to Egypt, as well as the name that is of Greek origin, refer to an entity that had a strong presence in the magical tradition that mixes elements of Greek-Egyptian culture. This tradition, according to what has been proposed by these authors, presents a hypothesis that can be considered modest and that deserves to be explored. They don't say that this is the definitive reading by any means, they just raise the ball by saying that perhaps this could be Christian graffiti ridiculing this worshipper of a non-Christian entity, which would be the 7 Typhons. But the authors themselves recognize there that it is a plausible hypothesis that they consider plausible, but also the other hypothesis, which is the majority hypothesis, they don't reject in any way. I'll even leave references for you to consult, as always, for anyone who wants to delve deeper into this discussion, in the description of the video. But that's it if the majority position, if you're correct, is that this is an intervention, a graffiti from the beginning or middle of the 3rd century before Christ and which really represents a Christian worshipping the crucified Jesus. This would be the oldest representation of Jesus that we have today, and it is a very unusual appearance. But it gives us many elements to understand not only the physical appearance of Jesus, but the cultural environment of nascent Christianity. We thank you very much for your attention and for taking the time to accompany us, as you usually do. So we say goodbye here and we'll meet again in our next video to come. May the Lord bless you intensely and abundantly. bringing countless graces and blessings into your life.